Man, that is frustrating and disappointing as I guess an American citizen. Well, let's take that energy back 40 years, if you will, Chip. Listeners of this program will know that I have a longstanding fascination with the Nixon tapes. This takes us to the morning of June 14th, 1971, the morning the Pentagon Papers were released. And this is Henry Kissinger. First, we're going to hear from John Mitchell, the United States Attorney General, who is, as far as I remember, suggesting legal action against the New York Times, and then Henry Kissinger comes in. And I just want your response to this. Feel free to tell me to pause whenever, but as a civil liberties expert, here's.
I love this Nixon tapes too. So
this is a great one too. Because Nixon, people won't know, but you got the news from Alexander Haig earlier, and it hadn't seen it in the paper.
And the reason why is because also on the front page of the New York Times was an article about his daughter's wedding, and he was much more interested in the Patricia Nixon news than the Pentagon Papers. And Haig and Kissinger had to come direct him to the story next to it.
Exactly.
I'm not making this up. This is
absolutely true. And if you read the Nixon or listen to the Nixon tapes, you'll hear a lot of calls about that wedding. They were very preoccupied with the lead up. It's big news in the White House.
Hello, Mr. President. What is your advice on that Times thing, John? You would like to do it?
I would believe so, Mr. President. Otherwise, we will look a little foolish in not following through on our legal obligations. And
has this ever been done before?
Publication like this, or
no. Has the government ever done this to a paper before?
Oh yes, advising of their. Yes, we've done this before.
So that part, I just want to stop there. He says advising them of their, and then he kind of trails off. That is kind of like the chicken shit way of the Nixon administration, never really naming what they want done. Really, which he's saying like, well, we're going to threaten a lawsuit, correct?
So I don't know about the advice thing, but that is a routine thing they will do in the government. They will advise papers not to publish stuff. I was sort of finishing up our interview with an NSA whistleblower today, and I was going back through the story by which the New York Times published a 2005 story about illegal NSA spying of U.S. citizens, and the journalist had the story for over a year, and the New York Times kept blocking them from publishing it because the NSA and the Bush administration lobbied them not to. And finally, the one was like, "I'm going to publish this in my book," and then the New York Times got very territorial and did so. So they do advise them not to publish stuff, and sometimes they do listen, like the NSA warrantless surveillance story. The New York Times spiked for a year during the Bush administration, and had that story come out before the 2004 election, could it have changed the outcome? Probably not. I don't think that much of fine, but it is a big question we have to ask.
Right. We'll continue a little bit more with this. And the final question I want to ask about this is, have things gotten worse? But we'll continue here.
Paper before.
Oh yes, advising of their. Yes, we've done this before.
Have we? All right.
Yes, sir. I would think that.
How do you go about it? You do it sort of low key.
Low key. You call them and then send a telegram to confirm it.
Mm-hmm. And say that we're examining the situation, and we just simply are putting you on notice.
Well, we're putting them on notice that they're violating a statute because we have a communication from Mel Laird as to the nature of the documents, and they fall within a statute. Now, I don't know whether you've been noticed it, but this thing was. Mel was working.
Henry's on the other. He just walked in. I'll put him on the other line. Go ahead.
Mel had a pretty good go up there before the committee today on it, and it's all over town and all over everything, and I think we'd look a little silly if we just didn't take this low-key action of advising them about the publication.
Did Mel take a fairly hard line on it?
Yes, he gave a legal opinion, and it was a violation of the law, which puts us at where we have to get.
Well, look. As far as the Times is concerned, hell, they're our enemies. I think we just ought to do it. And anyway, Henry, tell them what you just heard from Rostow.
Well, Rostow called on behalf of Johnson, and he said that it is Johnson's strong view that this is an attack on the whole integrity of government. That if whole file cabinets can be stolen and then made available to the press, you can't have orderly government anymore. Well, and he said if the president defends the integrity, any action we take, he will back publicly.
There you go.
That's Kissinger at the end, right?
Yeah, that's Kissinger at the end.
That's somebody who is still invited by these assholes to go and speak and opine on American interventions around the globe while he's talking like that about the papers or something else, man. Jesus Christ.
Yeah, and it's worth noting what the Nixon administration does is they enjoin the Times from publishing the story. Then the Washington Post published it, and then they're enjoined, and it goes on. And then finally it goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules you can't impose a prior restraint in this case, but they don't execute them after the fact. So while the Pentagon Papers case is a First Amendment victory for prior restraint, there was very much a chilling of the printing of it. And Mike Gravel, Senator Mike Gravel, reads this into the Senate record and then moves to try to get a person to publish it. And because you can still be prosecuted after the fact, no one wants to publish it except for the Unitarian Church, Beacon Press, which publishes an edition with, I believe, annotations by Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky. And that's a whole First Amendment battle in its own right that oftentimes gets overlooked, sort of the small left-wing Unitarian press, which did a lot of heavy lifting versus a sort of celebratory attitude we have towards it, which we should celebrate with the Times. They did stand up for principle, but it is unfortunate that they sort of get all the credit and Beacon Press does not.
Yeah, there's also the element of just the assassination of Ellsberg's character, right? Like Nixon sending hatchet men to break into his psychiatrist's office.
It brings down his presidency. That's the beginning of Watergate. It unravels his presidency, his obsession with Nixon, or not with Nixon, with Ellsberg. And if he had just been left to his own devices, he would have been more fixated on his daughter's wedding, and perhaps would have served out his term.
Yeah, there you go. David, do you have something you want to? Chip, I got a hot potato to throw your way.
I know you do. I know.
So the way I formulate it is this way. So we have all this history that we're aware of as sort of the right and the FBI and the way it attacks the left. And we're now in this sort of, I guess, even in the 9/11 era, with the sort of use of informants to basically entrap Muslims. That pattern recognition is all here. And now we're seeing it applied in a way that is a little bit harder to, I think, field, which is the right-wing extremist threat being used as a way to bolster the national security state or domestic spying. How are you looking at these developments?
Well, it's a very complex problem, and a lot of people on the left can be very divided about it. I understand that a lot of the sort of fascist violence is targeted at it's not. Some of it is sort of, mass violence, but some of it is targeted. So people do feel very personally threatened by it in a way they might not other forms of violence. And it is very horrific, right? It is grisly to watch. So far as there is a terrorist threat to the United States, or a threat of violence to the United States, right? It comes from the right, it doesn't come from the left. Al Qaeda did attack us on 9/11, but bulk of the sort of violence like that in the interceding years has come from the domestic right. So far as you can say, this type of violence is a problem, and you can talk about the degree to which sort of interpersonal violence of any nature is or isn't a major problem. It is coming from the right, and I understand people who feel very threatened by this being very concerned. The history of the FBI and law enforcement with the far right is a very complex. I think we oftentimes on the left want it to be a straightforward history, but it's very complex. It can be very difficult to wade through. Local law enforcement has traditionally, in the South, collaborated with the Ku Klux Klan and was absolutely part and parcel of Klan violence. We see things like that going on today, like the Portland police and the Proud Boys. On the other hand, there are FBI agents who infiltrate right-wing groups from time to time, and they're instructed limit information they share with the local police because the local police might turn them over and get them killed. Gary Rowe is the most notorious FBI Ku Klux Klan informant during the 60s. He murders people, right, and gets away with it because he's an FBI. There's no question that he killed people. I can go and we do a whole episode of him on Still Spying, and you can listen to that and learn his unsavory past. But one of the things he did when he was in the Klan was that he beat up freedom riders, and the Birmingham police told him they had 15 minutes to beat them up, and then they would come like, "Oh, what are you doing here?" Stage sort of intervention. And he told the FBI, and they did nothing about it. But also there's an incident where he does tell the FBI about violence coming, and a state trooper pulls them over. How many of the Klansmen? And the state trooper flat out says to Rowe, the FBI informant, "You've got a snitch in your midst." And threatens one of the Klan members with violence. A sheriff does if he talks about some of the bombings. So very, very mixed record here. And the FBI did initiate a counterintelligence program against the Ku Klux Klan and similar groups. And it wasn't a fake COINTELPRO. Like sometimes we'll go, that was just for show. It was real. And the rationale for it is interesting on a number of levels. The Kennedy administration, Bobby and John F. Kennedy, are liberal anti-communist. They're also committed to civil rights. So when there's these grisly murders of civil rights activists, especially realistically white ones from the North, they're putting pressure on Hoover and others like, why don't you do to the Klan what you do to the communist? And the other thing to remember is that counterintelligence program is not a law enforcement program. It's an intelligence program. The FBI is both a law enforcement and an intelligence agency. What does that mean? I know in the age of like abolish, we've all come to accept that the police are about social control. But like in theory, the police are supposed to be gathering information for prosecution. Intelligence, you're just, doing stuff. So they moved the Ku Klux Klan stuff out of the criminal division of the FBI that could prosecute them and put it in the intelligence division, and instead focus on these disruptive activities where they like dox people and get them fired, or they instruct Gary Rowe to sleep with Klan wives to break up marriages. And as the Church Committee found, unlike the other COINTELPRO operations, especially that against the Black Panthers, this one was the most narrowly tailored to people who were actually engaged in violence. If you have evidence that someone is a violent Klans member, is it better to like intervene and prosecute them, or intervene into restorative justice, which isn't actually an option at this point? Like prosecution is your option. Or is it better to sleep with their wife and break up their marriage? Like which is the better thing to do? And I have strong feelings about that. On the other hand, today, let's jump to today, then as well, the FBI has immense political bias against civil rights and Black Lives Matter activism. The Hoover refused to investigate the lynching of Emmett Till, saying there was no federal jurisdiction to do so, even though the Department of Justice, which the FBI is a part of, was founded to go after Klan violence in the South and prosecuted hundreds of people in the 1860s during Reconstruction for doing this. Hoover said there was no such law, and it was just a communist plot to get things whipped up. And similarly now, we sort of see right-wing groups plotting violence in broad daylight, and the FBI is chasing around people who are engaged in political speech. So what do we do with the sort of real threat of real violence from these groups on the right, but also we don't want to bolster the security state? And what my position is that the authorities of the FBI must be limited to looking at instances where people are actually breaking the law and actually engaged in violence, that would stop them from these fishing expeditions against Palestinian activists, against Occupy, against Black Lives Matter, where they say, well, they're not plotting any violence, but maybe they'll do so later. And it would focus them on some of these right-wing groups. And it would also force them to focus on some of these right-wing groups in a way that isn't just repeating the mistakes of the war on terror, right? I don't terribly think it would be useful for the FBI to devote a lot of attention to fishing expeditions where you're going after people with hateful speech and ignoring the people engaged in violence, right? You need to focus on those who are engaged in violence, and you do that by limiting the powers of the FBI and limiting their focus. I think the other thing you alluded to is that there's this weird sort of convergence of like longtime national security hawks with people who have good faith concern about racial injustice in this country, which is very real, to sort of create this campaign for expanding the powers of the FBI and the DHS and create a new domestic terrorism law in a way that's just going to allow the FBI to have even more powers that they'll use once again to go after Black Lives Matter some more, go after some Occupy some more, right? Well, their Occupy is gone, but Occupy-like groups. And I think that's really concerning, and it's hard to know how to respond in an appropriate way when you read Joseph Biden's sort of domestic terrorism plan, the first time they've ever done a whole of government plan about domestic as opposed to international terrorism. It has this narrative about domestic terrorism that I find very, very sympathetic, where they talk about violence during Reconstruction. They talk about the Tulsa massacre. But they're using that to sort of garner support for policies that we've already seen in the war on terror that are now being rehabilitated. And it's worth pointing out that Muslim American civil rights groups, Arab American civil rights groups, who've been the hardest hit by these programs, have for like half a decade now been extremely vocal, being like, no, 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 no. We don't want these programs to be equal opportunity. We don't want you rehabilitating them. We want you getting rid of them. And there was actually a huge, I don't know if this is public information or not. Some of the groups, there was Life After Hate, right? They got a Countering Violent Extremism grant to do stuff with former skinheads. They also got a grant to study radicalization in the Muslim community. And it was through this program called CVE, Countering Violent Extremism, that was opposed by the Muslim American community. And when Trump cut that grant off, there was a bunch of big liberal groups, big left groups that were, making hay of that. And like Arab American and Muslim American civil rights groups like quietly met with them and said, hey, please stop doing this. You're hurting our community. And they wouldn't do it. So if you're not persuaded by my very perhaps antiquated old school civil libertarian perspective, at least think about what the groups who have been impacted by the international war on terrorism are telling you, and maybe have some pause.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And it also reminds me, I think the House Un-American Activities Committee that originally was supposed to look into both the far right and the far left, and we know ultimately which side that came down on.
Yes.
And I just want to, one book, I don't know if you've heard about this, but there's a book called Phantom Terror. It's about this guy, Adam Zamoyski. And it's about the Clemens von Metternich sort of post-Napoleon phase in Europe, where he's basically the J. Edgar Hoover of Europe. And it's instead of anti-communism, it's anti-republicanism. And there's documentation from that time of guys having these meetings, informants having meetings with people and then reporting them. And everybody involved was an informant, but didn't know the other people were.
This is the Metternich that's mentioned in the opening line of the Communist Manifesto?
Yes.
I never realized who that was. I should have been more inquisitive and asked.
Put Phantom Terror on your vacation.
Please send me this. Yes.
You'll like it. But Chip Gibbons, you can find him at Chip Gibbons 89. Where else should people look for your work, Chip?
Check out the website of Defending Rights in Dissent, rightsindissent.org. If you want to hear the Primary Sources podcast, it's available on all of the podcasting apps. There's more of them than I ever knew existed, but you can also get it at primarysourcespodcast.org, and you can find the FBI podcast, which is now done at stillspying.org or on your podcasting app of choice. I had no idea there were so many ways to listen to podcasts. I've never heard of some of these things, but sometimes they delay putting one of the episodes on. They're like, oh, what about Stitcher? I haven't gotten to the episode. I'm like, what the fuck is Stitcher? Why are you DMing me this?
Oh, yeah.
And it's just,
the branches go deeper than that, too.
Oh, yeah.
I know. No, I know. That's just the one I can remember.
I know what you mean.
Thanks, Chip.
Thank you for having me.